How do different areas of knowledge relate? Maybe these areas of knowledge are academic fields or disciplines. Maybe they're schools of ethics or competing visions of goodness. Or maybe they're just forms of human knowledge that aren't academic in nature, anything from a trade to a cultural perspective. How do they relate? I'm going to focus on academic knowledge because that's where most of the scholarly work has been done. And you'll find that there are resemblances with schools of ethics, with visions of goodness, with forms of life and cultures. Here are 8 models of how different fields of knowledge relate. I'm classifying them under 3 broad categories. The first one is domination. Someone wins. One field simply conquers the other by demonstrating that it's not valid, not helpful. Astrology, alchemy. There are many disciplines that no longer exist, at least not in respected circles, because they have been defeated. You see the warfare or the conflict model a lot in popular perceptions of how science and religion relate. In fact, it's much more complicated. There are many scientists who are believers and many believers who have adopted scientific principles deeply into their worldview. Nevertheless, the conflict or the warfare model persists in a lot of popular perceptions, and it sells a lot of books, and it shows up on TV and gets a lot of viewers. Today, you can see the so-called new atheists often adopting a warfare domination model where science is simply going to take over and destroy the fields of knowledge that can't compete with it because they don't offer reliable knowledge. A second variety of the domination model I'm going to call imperialism, where one field dominates the others and sets the terms by which they are allowed to operate. In the Middle Ages, theology came to be called Queen of the Sciences, the ruler of the realm of areas of knowledge. The term sciences did not mean then what it means now. Now it means a certain kind of inquiry with a certain method, the scientific method. Back in the Middle Ages, the sciences were any area of discovery, legitimate discovery. Well, theology was the form of discovery that ruled the others. This approach back in the day was called ecclesiasticism, and it provoked a pushback from those modern sciences, claiming that science, since it was a better method of understanding, it should dictate the terms by which we understand even the field of theology. And so in the 19th century, you got a field called religion, which took social scientific method to the task of understanding why people buy into these things called religions. And that turned the tables on ecclesiasticism. Now you have its opposite, scientism, which tries to set the terms by which other fields operate, whether they are religion or theology or other humanities. If in the Middle Ages theology was queen of the sciences, in a scientistic framework dominated by scientific method, theology kind of seems like the Queen of Hearts from Alice in Wonderland, a crazy field of people who don't buy into the assumptions that ordinary rational people have to. Well, that's just a contrary form of domination. The two camps fight it out to this day in, on the one hand, young earth creationism, which is a kind of modern ecclesiasticism where an inerrant literal Bible sets the terms by which science has to operate. After all truth is God's truth, and the Bible's truth trumps ordinary discoverable truth. And counterposed to that approach is the treatment of religion as an entirely natural phenomenon, as some kind of psychological epiphenomenon of the brain that can be isolated and understood through scientific methods. In ethics, divine command theory represents a domination model. Evolutionary ethics is also obviously a domination model. The pushback from each side demonstrates that the imperialist model is unwelcome. Our disciplines don't invite or want that kind of domination, nor do they actually work that way. We're not dogs that can be domesticated. We're wolves that resist domestication. A third variety of domination is reductionism, where one field is reduced to the terms of a dominating field. It's dissolved into that broader area. Evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson thinks sociobiology, the evolutionary paradigm applied to human nature, will ultimately discover all forms of human knowledge. It will not just dominate fields, it will become the way of understanding human behavior and all things human. The arts will become varieties of evolutionary biology. Literature will become an arm of evolutionary biology. That's reductionism. One field reduces to the terms of the other. E.O. Wilson is just a contemporary strain of a long trend in the Enlightenment of reductionism. Durkheim reduced religion to sociology. Marx reduced everything to economic relations and the politics underneath. Reductionism has a long and cherished history in learning. Our second broad area is détente, a word from the Cold War era, meaning you stay on your side, I'll stay on my side, we'll mind our own business. This actually reaches right back to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, where the wars of religion were ended basically just with a stalemate, a settlement. If a region has a Catholic king, that's a Catholic country. If a region has a Protestant king, it's a Protestant country. Well, that's not a solution, but it does stop the conflict. Détente in learning looks like a kind of demilitarized zone in between disciplines, where each discipline sticks to its own isolated domain and avoids domains that are controlled by the other disciplines. You hear that all the time in school. That's not my field. Don't ask me. Go ask someone in that other department. Stephen Jay Gould described science and religion as so-called non-overlapping magisteria, just like the Catholic and Protestant fiefdoms in 17th century Europe. They're non-overlapping, and each field has its own guild, has its own authorities, its magistrates, that set the terms for that field. Of course, these demilitarized zones keep getting violated. We keep encroaching on each other's disciplinary territory. And so this is not necessarily a long-term solution. It's just a short-term solution. On the other side of this spectrum is an attitude of collaboration between or among these sovereign disciplines. Partnerships happen all the time, in the academy and between departments and specialties. Nations enter into treaties. Corporations make agreements. Entities that are independent or at least magisteria in a given field enter into agreements all the time for shared mutual interests. Maybe they have a common goal, the welfare of the world, or a common enterprise of knowledge in the case of academics. Or maybe they're acting out of their own narrower interests. Collaboration is one form of détente, and fragmentation, or isolation, is another form of détente. In ethics, you might see this in the form of cultural relativism. Each culture sets its own terms. Or ethical egoism. Each individual sets his or her own terms. Those are both forms of détente. Our third cluster of models I'm calling domestication, where some other grand framework tames each of these other fields and brings them into its submission. Sphere sovereignty refers to a model for relating disciplines by Abraham Kuyper, a Reformed theologian and also a prime minister of the Netherlands, who thought that God's creation of a diverse, plural world was an expression of his common grace on all. And therefore, each field of knowledge or each sphere of activity has its own autonomy, its relative autonomy. However, his special revelation, his special grace, his saving grace for the elect, transcends those different boundaries, which means all of these spheres are arranged around or below a center. Under Kuyper, the Netherlands were structured under what was called pillarization. Each pillar stood on its own, and yet each one is part of the larger project governed by the state and spiritually governed by the state church, the Reformed Church of the Netherlands. You can see something like sphere sovereignty in a contemporary university, where each department has its own relative autonomy in matters of its own learning. However, all of them are obedient servants of the institution and the institutional mission. The turf wars then aren't just between one discipline and another. They are between the faculty and the administration, between the leaders of these different spheres and the governor of all of them, whose job it is to keep everything in harmony and order and a common direction that's fruitful for the overall project. My next model of domestication I'm calling pragmatism. Pragmatism basically means practice, or praxis is the guiding force behind everything else. So pragmatism just does what works and will choose eclectically, kind of cafeteria style, from whatever options there are for a purpose that's marginal to all of those choices. A university that's struggling financially or struggling for enrollment or wants greater prestige might just drop the things that aren't contributing to that cause, small struggling departments, athletic programs that don't draw, and undertake efforts that are more promising. Maybe starting pre-professional programs or a graduate school. Maybe sponsoring or promoting a sports team whose popularity is rising. All of this is for the life of the institution, supposedly. It isn't necessarily for the fields that are being added, let alone the fields that are being dropped. The overarching goal is just the prosperity of the institution. Well, that's a domestication model. Pragmatism is also an approach in ethics which will plunder other models of ethics to see what works best for its own goals, whatever those goals are. And of course, where faith is concerned, Christianity, religion, faith gets plundered all the time for its utility to some other cause. Maybe religion will make a society better. Maybe it'll help you live a more prosperous life. Maybe it'll heal your psychological issues. These are all forms of religious pragmatism, which ends up not looking very different from any other form of pragmatism. And my final form of domestication, I'm going to call cynicism. That's where fields of knowledge, forms of life, cultures, traditions, ethics are sidelined just out of apathy, out of the burnout of a society or a person that's done with the struggle, or which has had a bad experience with one school and which generalizes from that one field to all fields. If I hated my major, it means all learning is bad. If I grew up in a toxic environment in one religion, then all religion is bad. Cynicism can look like anti-intellectualism. It can look like cheap skepticism. It can look like apathy towards all fields rather than just one's rival fields. It can be as benign as Homer Simpson from the TV series. It can be as deadly as the Khmer Rouge. Cynicism about learning or life is a domestication. Actually, the domestication under nihilism, the notion that nothing is ultimate. It's alongside pragmatism and sphere sovereignty, in which something other than the learning, something other than the ethical system, etc., tames the rest, restricts their reach according to its overarching rules.